Just give people a couple of minutes just to join.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Emma, could you give us a tip off for when we're good to go?
Perfect, that's us now.
So we're good to go?
Yeah, that's us.
Thanks a million. Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Margaret Hines O'Flanagan. I'm the Registrar and Interim CEO of CORU, the Health and Social Care Professionals Regulator in Ireland. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join us for today's information session. At the outset, I want to highlight that we are recording this session and the recording will be circulated to all attendees in the coming days. It'll also be made available on the CORU website if you want to refer to it or share it with your colleagues. I'm joined today by Catherine Byrne. Catherine's our Head of Strategy and Policy, and by Gillian Ryan, our Communications Manager, who will be moderating this morning's session. We've invited you to meet with us today to update you on the next steps of the process towards the regulation of counsellors and psychotherapists in Ireland. I'm delighted so many of you have joined us today. As far as I'm aware, we have well over 100 attendees joining us from across the country, representing a wide range of professional bodies, including professions, education providers currently delivering counselling and psychotherapy programs, organisations that deliver counselling and or psychotherapy services, along with representatives from a number of state agencies and government departments, particularly in the education and health sectors. We welcome you all. Your support as stakeholders will be invaluable as we work to regulate counsellors and psychotherapists for the first time. We previously held an information session with many of you last December, where we discussed the processes for regulating a profession. This involves setting the threshold level of education and standards for entry to the profession, the approval and monitoring processes for education providers, and the registration process once a register opens, including how existing practitioners can register during what is known as the transition period, the first 2 years when a register is open. In our session this morning, we're going to focus on the first of these areas, the setting of the threshold level of education and training standards. At the conclusion of our presentation, there will be an opportunity to answer some of your questions. If you have any questions during the presentation, please use the chat function to send them to us, and we'll use the time remaining at the end of the presentation to address as many of these as we can. The Counsellors and Psychotherapists Registration Board has been working on setting what are known as the standards of proficiency. These are the threshold level of knowledge and skills required for entry to the register in each profession. They've also been working on the criteria for education and training programs, which describe the requirements to actually deliver graduates who meet up the standards of proficiency. It's important to bear in mind that these are distinct. The standards focus on outcomes and the criteria set out key components of how those standards are delivered. The board has developed draft criteria and standards for each of the professions, one set for counsellors and one set for psychotherapists. We're now at the point of launching the stakeholder consultation on these. This will launch next Monday and close on Friday, the 1st of December, 2023. This is your opportunity to review what the board has drafted and provide your feedback. Your feedback is invaluable to our work, and it's your opportunity to ensure that we achieve the best possible outcomes by including your expertise and insights in this process. Our focus today is to provide an introduction to the criteria and to the standards, and to outline the board's process in developing these draft documents. We'll turn to that specifically in a few minutes, but first I just want to spend a short time providing some context to this work by introducing CORU and our legislative remit. You're probably all familiar with CORU, hopefully so, but just to give you a brief introduction, CORU is Ireland's first and only multi-profession health and social care regulator. Established in 2007, our role is to protect the public. We do this by promoting high standards of professional conduct, education, training and competence through statutory registration of the designated list of health and social care professionals. Our first register, which was for social workers, opened in 2011. Since then, we've opened 11 further registers. Today, we regulate roughly 25,000 health and social care professionals in Ireland. Regulation is central to public protection, professional trust, and the evolution of professions. The step into regulation invariably represents a turning point for evolving professions. This process is part of ensuring that that transition is effective and beneficial for the professions of counselling and psychotherapy. We know that you are just as committed to protecting the public as we are, and in particular, we recognise that regulation will bring about changes in how counsellors and psychotherapists in Ireland are educated and trained. So I want you to know that we recognise that change can be challenging, but we will continue to work with you. We will listen to you, and we hope we can support each other to achieve a common purpose of ensuring protection of the public through the regulation of suitably qualified counsellors and psychotherapists. CORU's governance model provides for each profession to have its own registration board, which has 13 members with a lay majority. In saying this, it's important to note that when the Minister for Health established the Counsellors and Psychotherapists Registration Board, he designated that there should be one board with 2 distinct registers, one for each profession. This is the same as we have for some other of the professions we regulate. For example, radiographers and radiation therapists are both managed by the Radiographers Registration Board. Each registration board is responsible for setting the standards that professionals must meet, ensuring that education providers deliver qualifications that prepare professionals to provide safe and appropriate care by assessing, approving and monitoring training programs, establishing and maintaining a register or registers of members of the professions, establishing the code of professional conduct and ethics which registered professionals must adhere to, and ensuring that registered professionals keep their skills up to date by promoting continuing professional development. The boards also look at people who qualify internationally, and that's another key area of activity there. All of the work is undertaken by a board with its principal objective to ensure public protection. Ultimately, the board is responsible for establishing and maintaining the register or registers for the professions it is responsible for. This is the milestone we aim towards for each profession, because it is only when this happens that we can truly protect the public. So that's a quick introduction to CORU. Let's look now specifically at the work of the Counsellors and Psychotherapists Registration Board. Counsellors and psychotherapists were not included among the list of professions to be regulated in the original 2005 Health and Social Care Professionals Act. However, both professions were designated by the Minister for Health for regulation in 2016. At that time, following feedback from a Department of Health public consultation, the Minister for Health designated that there was to be one registration board, the Counsellors and Psychotherapists Registration Board, which would be responsible for 2 registers, one for counsellors and one for psychotherapists. The board was formally established by the Minister for Health in February 2017, and since then has been working towards implementing the Minister's direction to establish 2 separate registers. Following the establishment of a registration board, there is an extensive process that must be undertaken to prepare for the opening of a register. So I know you might say 2017, what year is it now? As you'll see as we go forward, there's a huge volume of work that needs to be done to get this right. There are a number of different steps, each of which, as you can imagine, are quite lengthy in and of themselves. The first is the setting of the 2 key documents, the standards of proficiency and the criteria in education for training programs. Catherine will shortly introduce these in greater detail. Once a board has finished its standard and the associated criteria, they are issued to education providers who have a period of time to align their curricula to the delivery of the standards and to ensure that they have all the necessary quality assurance processes in place before the process of programme approval begins. While this is ongoing, the board sets its code of professional conduct and ethics, which articulates the professional standards of conduct, performance and ethics a registered member of the profession must adhere to. The final step of the process is the one where the board makes its bylaws. These are statutory instruments that are set out in law that list approved qualifications, registration process to be used by the board, the code of conduct. These put the legal structures in place to allow a board to open its register. The Counsellors and Psychotherapists Registration Board is at the stage of setting its standard and its criteria now. The process for a board to set its standard and its standards and its criteria is well established. It starts with possibly the most extensive part of the process, the initial drafting of the standards and of the criteria for each profession. The board then must take a decision to formally adopt the draft documents for the purpose of stakeholder consultation. This is the point the Counsellors and Psychotherapists Registration Board is currently at. Following the consultation, the board reviews all feedback received, evaluates it, and where it deems appropriate, revises its standards and/or the criteria before agreeing to formally adopt them as the standards for the profession. At this stage, the documents are then published and sent to education providers for them to begin the process of alignment. So the Counsellors and Psychotherapists Registration Board has drafted 4 documents: the Standards of Proficiency for Counsellors, the Criteria for Education and Training Programmes for Counsellors, the Standards of Proficiency for Psychotherapists, and the Criteria for Education and Training Programmes for Psychotherapists. All 4 documents will form part of the board's stakeholder consultation, which we will provide you with more detail on at the end of this presentation. I'm now very pleased to hand over to my colleague, Catherine Byrne, our Head of Strategy and Policy, who's been working with the Counsellors and Psychotherapists Registration Board since its establishment. Catherine will talk in more detail about the Standards of Proficiency and the criteria, along with the process the board took in developing its draft. Thank you, Catherine.
Thanks, Margaret. So starting with first principles, what are the Standards of Proficiency? The Standards of Proficiency articulate the threshold level or minimum level of knowledge, skills and professional attributes that an applicant to the register must have met in order to be eligible for entry to the register. Once they are met, the board, and indeed the public, can have confidence the professional can practice safely in the profession. They are the minimum standards for entry into a profession. They are not standards of practice after entry to the register. As we have already noted, given that there are 2 registers, the board has been required to draft 2 sets of standards. One set that articulates the entry-level practice for counsellors, and another set that articulates the entry-level practice of psychotherapists. What do we mean by threshold level? It might seem slightly contradictory when we're talking about public safety and protection, but what it means is that in setting its standards, the board is ensuring that a potential registrant is able to practice safely from day one. The board cannot set any post-registration training requirements. For example, the board cannot set a condition to a new registrant to say they may practice and provide one form of counselling, but must complete additional training in order to provide another. Therefore, the board must be confident that all its standards are met at the time of registration. So while it is described as a threshold standard, this is a very high standard, and it is set so high to ensure public protection. In many ways, the question around what the standards are used for has been answered in what we've been talking about for much of this presentation so far. So just for summary purposes, the standards are used by the registration board in assessing whether an applicant is eligible to join its register. It's important to highlight that these are threshold standards which are set for entry into practice in Ireland. Therefore, any applicant from Ireland or from outside the state must demonstrate achievement of the same standards. Education providers use the standards to design their education and training programmes and ensure that their curricula align to them. A student graduating from the programme has demonstrated achievement of all the standards. The public has access to the standards as well and can use them to understand what the practice of the profession is at the entry level. When a board, and this is the case with the Counsellors and Psychotherapists Registration Board, publishes its draft standards for consultation, it is the product of extensive research, discussion and analysis. The board is comprised of members from each profession, those who work in education and training, both in the professions and independent of them, and lay members. Together, they bring a range of perspectives and experience of the professions and how each is practiced in Ireland. To this, the board also considered an extensive review of academic literature and comparison with other comparator international standards where they exist for these professions. All of these components, taken together, went into identifying what areas of knowledge and skills need to be articulated in each set of standards. When a board decides what needs to be included in its standards, it then must decide how it wants to articulate these standards. In writing its standards, the Counsellors and Psychotherapists Registration Board has attempted to ensure that the standards are outcomes focused, in that they state the knowledge or skill a graduate must be able to do in order to practice safely. To this end, they are succinct and flexible. They aren't prescriptive in stating how a student is to be taught these areas of knowledge or skills, or how they should be demonstrated. They are written in a way that allows for their application across a range of different therapeutic environments, reflecting the nature and practice of both professions. And they are holistic in nature. The standards should be read as a whole. There's no hierarchy or one standard that's more important than another. These standards are standards that interconnect and overlap. As we'll see in our next slide, it's not possible to achieve a standard in isolation. We've had a look at the board's approach to developing its standards. So the next question is, what do they look like? The standards are comprised of two key elements: standards common across all CORU regulated professions. These are what are known as our framework standards. They are found in domains 1, 2, 3 and 4, and a small number of standards in domain 5. The board adopts these standards and does not make any changes to them. Standards that are profession specific. These are developed specifically to reflect the threshold level of professional knowledge and skills of each profession and are found in domain 5 of the standards document. We'll have a quick look at domains 1 to 4 before we discuss the profession specific standards. Standards in domain 1 are concerned with the professional and ethical behaviours of a counsellor or psychotherapist in the delivery of therapeutic treatment. This includes areas such as ensuring informed consent is received from a service user in advance of the delivery of any treatment, practices around confidentiality, and maintaining professional boundaries with a service user. The second domain, communication, collaborative practice and teamworking, addresses the key skills needed to select and apply the appropriate communication tools when engaging with service users and colleagues, along with the ability of a counsellor or psychotherapist to work when appropriate as part of a team. Domain 3 focuses on ensuring the safe delivery of treatment with a service user and the mechanisms in place to review and modify a treatment approach in order to provide appropriate and quality care to a service user. The standards in Domain 4 articulate proficiencies around the importance of and engagement with continuing professional development. The majority of standards in Domain 5 are specific and particular to each profession, and the board has drafted standards which reflect the knowledge, skills and behaviours required for delivery of safe counselling or psychotherapy practice at the threshold level. We'll take a closer look now at these profession-specific standards. The counselling and psychotherapeutic professions, although different, share similar professional characteristics. This is reflected in the draft standards for both professions. There are standards which are common to both. For instance, the delivery of treatment for both professions is rooted in building a relationship with the service user. Therefore, both sets of standards include the requirement be able to maintain professional and ethical boundaries with service users and be able to identify and manage any associated challenges. However, while both sets of standards address similar areas, because of the close relationship between both professions, differences emerge in the articulation of the specific knowledge and skills needed for the practice of each. So, for example, the counselling standards include the need for a practitioner to be able to appraise theories and research on mental health and obstacles to well-being. This is a specific requirement for counsellors. The psychotherapist standards include the requirement to be able to contract and recontract with the service users during a therapeutic relationship, ensuring the therapeutic goals and each person's expectations and responsibilities are clear to all parties. This is a specific requirement in the practice of psychotherapy. I've spoken at length about the standards of proficiency the board has developed for both professions. So now I'm going to turn and look at the other key document the board has drafted for consultation, the criteria for education and training programmes. The criteria and the standards are linked. They form part of the same education and training process. The criteria is used to ensure that a programme has the systems and mechanisms in place to demonstrate that students graduating from the programme have achieved all the standards of proficiency for the profession and are proficient in the practice of the profession to enter onto the register and practice safely and autonomously. Given there are 2 registers and 2 distinct sets of standards, there are also 2 sets of criteria, one for education and training programmes for counsellors and one for education and training programmes for psychotherapists. How is the criteria used by the registration board? The criteria is used to approve these education and training programmes. An education provider can make an application for their programme to be approved by the board. What follows is an extensive and detailed approval process whereby the programme is assessed and evaluated against each of the criteria. Only programmes that meet all the board's criteria are approved. It's important to stress that this is the route for new or future graduates seeking to enter the register once the register is open. For existing practitioners, there's a different route to enter the register during the first 2 years that a register is open, and this is known as the transition period. So what's in the criteria? A bit like the standards of proficiency, which are made up of common standards across each profession and profession-specific standards, the criteria is comprised in the same way. There are common criteria which cover areas such as curriculum design, assessment strategy, admissions processes, programme management and quality assurance mechanisms. There are 2 criteria which the board is able to tailor to suit profession-specific requirements. These relate to the threshold or minimum level of qualification on the National Framework of Qualifications, and approved qualifications must be designed at, and the requirements around practice placement hours. Before getting into the detail of the board's decisions around these profession-specific criteria, I'll quickly run through the common criteria. The criteria are structured around 6 broad criteria areas, and within each there are more detailed individual criteria. I'll talk more about the first criteria, the minimum level of qualification, in a minute, but just to highlight what the other areas address. Criteria 2 is concerned with the processes around how practice placements are integrated into the programme and how the education provider continually ensures high quality placement experiences for students. Criterion 3 looks at the mechanisms through which students are admitted onto a programme. Criterion 4 focuses on the management and governance arrangements the education provider has at an institutional and programme level, including, for instance, quality assurance mechanisms. Criterion 5 looks at the design of the programme curriculum and how it is mapped to the delivery of the standards of proficiency. And finally, Criterion 6, the assessment strategy, which details how the standards of proficiency are assessed and how an education programme ensures that a student who completes a programme has demonstrated achievement of all the standards. By ensuring education and training programmes have the necessary systems and mechanisms in place in order to consistently produce graduates who meet the standards of proficiency, the board's application of its criteria is a means through which it works to protect the public. Turning our attention now to the first profession-specific criterion, the threshold or minimum level of qualification for entry to the register. We've spoken about threshold level in terms of the standards of proficiency, but what does threshold mean in terms of the criteria? Threshold here refers to the minimum level on the National Framework of Qualifications a programme and its qualification must be designed to in order to deliver on the standards of proficiency. Programmes can be designed at a higher qualifications level above this threshold. For example, if we take one of our currently regulated professions, social work, the Social Workers Registration Board has set the threshold level at level 8. There are 2 programmes approved by the board at level 8, and all the other programmes approved, and this is most of them, are at a level 9. It's important to note that a programme designed at a level below the threshold would not be able to deliver on the standards of proficiency and would therefore not be eligible for approval by the board. So how did the board go about setting the threshold qualification level? The board reviewed the National Framework Qualification Level descriptors, which describe the knowledge, skills and competence required at each level on the framework. The board assessed the threshold level of practice articulated in the standards of proficiency for both professions and aligned this with the NFQ level descriptors. The board also recognised and factored into its decision that the counselling and psychotherapy professions should reflect Irish society and the people they serve, and therefore there should be an opportunity for all members in society to access higher education and enter these professions. Having undertaken this work, the board concluded that NFQ Level 7 does not reflect the demands of practice or depth of engagement with service user as required at the threshold level. The level descriptors at NFQ Level 9 go beyond the threshold level of proficiency articulated in the board standards for both counsellors and psychotherapists. Therefore, the board proposes to set the threshold level of entry for both professions at level 8. This level reflects the demands of each of the professions and the articulation of the range and application of knowledge and skills required in the board standards for both professions. The board, in determining the minimum threshold qualification for entry to its registers, recognised that for some here today, differences between the two professions have been linked to a level of qualification. In responding to the consultation, we would urge you to consider the differences articulated in the standards of proficiency for the professions, and whether, in your view, the knowledge, skills and competence for each profession could be designed and delivered at a minimum of a level 8 or above. The second profession-specific criterion that the board has set is the total number of practice placement hours. Before I get into the detail of the hours requirement, I want to talk about practice education in counselling and psychotherapy programs more generally. Practice education allows opportunities for students to engage directly in the practice of the profession under appropriate supervision in order to translate their learning in the classroom into practice. The placement setting, therefore, plays a central role in the assessment of students and their achievement of the standards of proficiency. This is why supervision at each placement site is so important. Placement is one of the key mechanisms through which the quality and safety of future practitioners is ensured. Education providers, more broadly, in providing for practice education, will be required to have, for example, a process in place for approving suitable placement sites that have appropriate on-site supervision for students, a process for how they allocate students to placement sites, monitoring and quality assurance processes to ensure the ongoing quality of placement education, mechanisms for training supervisors and placement sites, and a process around how assessments of students on placements are undertaken. Looking at practice placement hours specifically, the board has considered a range of factors in setting the hours requirement for both professions. It has factored in the practice of the profession and the types of engagement a practitioner has with a service user, the practice placement hours currently required by a range of professional bodies in Ireland, the threshold level of knowledge and skill as articulated in the standards of proficiency for both professions, and the requirement that students must demonstrate achievement of all standards of proficiency during their education and training. And on the basis of these considerations, the board has set 2 separate hours requirements, one for counsellors and one for psychotherapists. In setting distinct hours requirements, the board was mindful of the differences in practice between counselling and psychotherapy, in particular the wide-ranging presenting issues and the depth of the relationship required in the psychotherapeutic engagement. For counsellors, a student must complete 450 hours of practice placement education during the course of a programme, of which a minimum of 300 hours must be completed in supervised service user contact, and of those 300 hours, 75 must be in direct observed service user contact. For psychotherapists, a student must complete 500 hours of practice placement education during the course of a programme, of which a minimum of 350 hours must be completed in supervised service user contact, and of these 350 hours, 100 hours must be direct observed service user contact. So just to clarify what this means, the first line of each table refers to the total number of hours a student must complete in practice education as part of an education and training programme. This is comprised of 2 elements: the time on-site in a placement setting in the practice of the profession. This can include direct engagement with a service user, planning for a session with a service user, completion of reports and other administrative duties, all the things that go into practicing the profession, and the time allocated to academic activities associated with practice education. This could include, for example, completion of a placement portfolio or attendance at supervision meetings with a supervisor. Within this total number of placement hours, the board has stipulated that there is a minimum number of hours in supervised service user contact. These are the hours that a student is on site in a placement session, engaged in all of those activities that go into the practice of the profession. As I was noting just a moment ago, direct engagement with a service user, planning for that session and writing reports. At each placement site, a student must be assigned a suitably qualified and experienced on-site supervisor who ensures that the student receives appropriate support, guidance and supervision throughout the course of a practice placement. It's important to make a distinction here between supervision and observation. Supervision may include observation, but observation is not supervision. Observation is an essential component of how a student is assessed to have met the standard of proficiency. That's why the board has stipulated that of the amount of time students are on site in supervised service user contact, there must be a specific amount of time whereby the student is directly observed by a supervisor. There are a variety of ways that this kind of direct observation can be undertaken to allow for the sensitivity and integrity of the therapeutic relationship to be maintained. I appreciate that we have given you a lot of information this morning, and we will have time to answer some of your questions in a minute or so. Just before we do, I just wanted to highlight the process around which you will be able to provide your feedback on the draft standards and criteria the board has developed. There will be two separate consultations, one for the criteria and standards for counsellors and one for the criteria and standards for psychotherapists. You can respond to both or respond to one or the other. There will be a consultation questionnaire accessible from our website that will go live on Monday morning, the 4th of September, and will close on Friday, the 1st of December. During this period, feedback can also be sent directly to strategyandpolicy@coru.ie. The CORU website will also have copies of the draft criteria and standards for both professions, along with ebook resources which will provide summaries of the purposes of the criteria and standards and the board's rationale in drafting these documents. A recording of this presentation will also be available to you for you to access. With that, I'm going to hand over to Gillian and we'll address as many of the questions you have in the time remaining.
Thanks, Catherine. We have a number of questions that have come in through the chat. I'll start with this first one here. Will there be a section of the register specific to those who are qualified to work as psychotherapists with children? That is, in training in child art psychotherapy, all placement hours over the 4 years are working with under 18s.
So the board I suppose have to have two registers, one for counsellors and one for psychotherapists. So while individuals might be trained specifically for working with children, it will not be a separate register. They will be eligible to apply to register on the psychotherapist register.
Okay, thanks, Catherine. Another question here. There are a variety of ECTS associated with level 8 programs from 20 upwards. Is there a set level of ECTS for the threshold qualification 8?
So ECTS is concerned with the academic accreditation and would be the responsibility of QQI. The board, I suppose, wouldn't have any involvement with regard to the setting ECTS credits for programs.
Okay. Does the supervisor have to be physically on site for supervision?
So what we mean when we talk about a supervisor being on site is it's someone who's available to the student on the practice placement site itself. So they may not necessarily have to be there every single time the student is there engaging, I suppose, with the service user, but they should have some connection with the placement site and be available to provide a supervision, oversight and guidance and support to the student.
Okay, thanks, Catherine. Another key question that's come in is what are the key milestones and associated delivery dates of the registration process? And this is outlined for the years 24, 25 and 26.
Margaret, I don't know, do you want to? Margaret, I think you're on mute, sorry.
I think while Margaret's getting herself together, Mike.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Sorry, the laptop is misbehaving. The Minister will set the date on which the register opens. A significant amount of work has to be concluded before that's done, and then we will await the Minister's direction. We'll advise the Minister on progress, but then the Minister, he or she at the time, will set the date Catherine, I'm not sure there's more that can be added beyond that.
No, and I think part of the next phase of work, just to explain, is that obviously following the public consultation, the board will review all of the feedback that's received, and they will consider that in terms of any required changes or amendments to the standards and its criteria. Following which it will issue its criteria and standards. There's obviously then the board will have to make a decision around the time frame that will be required for education providers to make the necessary changes to their programme. So at this point, we're not able to give specific detail as to the next, how long the next kind of phase of work of the board will be required. That is really dependent, I suppose, on the work, the next phase of work, which is actually to agree and finalise its standards and criteria, and then to engage with education providers for how long they may require in order to align to the board's requirements.
Okay, thanks, Catherine. Just another question here is, can you say a little bit more about direct observation in practice?
Yeah, so I suppose there's various different methodologies for how this could be accomplished. So I suppose it's a core piece to be able to assess the students' achievement of the proficiencies, and that the supervisor would actually see them or have some methodology for assessing how they engage in the therapeutic process with the service user. So for example, there can be two-way screens. Sometimes the service user would agree to a recording or transcript of the counselling or the psychotherapeutic session that they've engaged with. So there's multiple different methodologies around how that direct observed practice of the student could be assessed in order to ensure that they are actually demonstrating the required proficiencies to practice safely. And again, this is an incremental process. You know, a student who is at the kind of an early stage of their education and training may require, I suppose, more direct observed, but by the time they're towards the end of their education and training program, they're moving towards much more autonomous practice at that point. So as I said, again, that is a decision of an education and training provider, how they design their program and their practice placement requirements to facilitate that for the student.
Okay, thanks, Catherine. There's a number of questions that have come in about personal therapy and querying whether this will be included in the criteria.
No. So obviously education providers and professional bodies can continue to require personal therapy to be undertaken by students. However, the board's concern is the achievement of the standards of proficiency. So the practice placement requirements are what, I suppose, ensure the student has the opportunity to demonstrate achievement of the proficiencies or through classroom base. So the personal therapy itself is not linked directly to the proficiencies or the achievement of the proficiencies, and therefore is outside of the remit of the board to set personal therapy hours requirement for students.
There's another question, Catherine, about placement supervisor. Does the placement supervisor specifically need to be a psychotherapist or counsellor, or could a mental health professional from an allied health discipline also supervise?
So the person who has responsibility for assessing the student's achievement of standard of proficiency while in the practice placement must be of the profession.
Okay. Another question, is program format at level 8 online, in-person, part-time, full-time length of also up to QQI?
So the methodology for how the program is run, Gillian, I think that's what I heard.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's the format.
Catherine, I think there's a little confusion emerging there. Just it's a degree program. So in terms of volume, in terms of ECTS credits, it's a degree program load, which I understand to be 60 credits.
Okay. And just in terms of the methodology, in terms of how the programs are delivered, just to confirm that we have approved various different methodologies of delivery, from blended models, which include online and in-person, as well as part-time programs and full-time programs. So again, the concern of the board is whether the program assures that all the students have achieved all the standards of proficiency. So again, as I said, the methodology that's selected by the education provider would be evaluated and assessed as to whether it ensures that specifically.
Okay, another question here is, what was the rationale to determine a 50 hours difference between the two professions?
So the board, when they were giving consideration to this, considered the length of engagement specifically, that like a counsellor would tend to have more shorter term engagement versus the psychotherapeutic process. So the hours requirement and the difference of the 50 hours were allowing for that length of engagement and depth of engagement with a service user over a course of period of time.
Okay. This question, within the standards, is there a one size fits all, or is there consideration given to differing modalities such as cognitive behavioral psychotherapy as opposed to, say, psychodynamic psychotherapy within the psychotherapy register?
So the standards themselves, as we said, are the threshold standards that should be achievable by any modality. So obviously education and training programs can still have a preference for a particular modality of counselling or psychotherapy, but at the minimum threshold, they must deliver on the standards that are set for either counsellors or for psychotherapists. So the board were very cognizant of that when they were designing the standards, so that it is flexible to continue to facilitate for the varied modalities in these professions, but that they are the threshold standards that no matter what modality you practice in, you have achieved these threshold standards.
Okay. Will there be a pre-accredited period following the course, or will people be able to register on completion of the programme?
Yeah. So just to explain, we're a qualifications-based register. The board do not have any statutory powers to set any post-registration conditions for practice for a registrant. So essentially, at the point where someone qualifies and has an approved qualification, they're eligible to apply to the register. That's why the standards have to be designed to ensure that the person at the point of entry to the register is sufficiently skilled to practice safely and autonomously in the profession. Professional bodies can still set their requirements for membership of their professional bodies. However, for the purposes of registration, no, the board have no remit in setting the pre-accreditation hours requirement.
Okay, there's a number of questions coming in on practice placement, so I hope I won't duplicate on them, but there's one here that queries, does practice placement supervision replace, or is it in addition to the individual and group supervision that is provided on a training course?
Sorry, Gillian, you might say that again.
Yeah, does practice placement supervision replace, or is it in addition to the individual and group supervision that is provided on a training course?
Yeah, so I think we might distinguish here what we mean by supervision. So I understand, as I said, when students are undertaking supervision, whether it's personally, it's around personal development and group supervision as well. When we talk about supervision, it's very much around the assessment of the student's achievement of the standards of proficiency while on the practice placement site. So absolutely, while the total hour requirements may involve the student's involvement with group supervision or individual supervision, you would still have to have someone responsible on the placement site who is the direct supervisor of that student. And again, it is as much about protection of the student to ensure that they are, I suppose, safe in what they're kind of engaging with service users, as well as about the safety of the service user as well.
Okay, there's another question here. 100 hours directly observed could be a huge challenge. Many clients may not be comfortable with recording of sessions.
And again, I suppose this is why this is going out for consultation, to hear the views and the feedback from the sector itself.
Okay, another question. Level 8 degree programs are major awards of 180 to 240 credits. 60 credit top-up qualifications are available for level 7 holders, but the overall credit volume is at least 180.
Thanks for that, Orla.
So Margaret or Catherine, which one of you want to?
That's just Orla's just clarifying that question about the volume, the ECTS versus the level. So sorry, I literally just meant thanks for that, Orla. It actually helps.
Okay, no problem.
Clarify that question once and for all.
Another question, why was a level 9 seen as too high?
A level 9 on the NFQ descriptors is very much in a specialist area of practice. It's beyond threshold. And I said the board when they were considering the minimum threshold, they really looked at how they have articulated their standards of proficiency. And when they look at the NFQ descriptors, it is at a level 8 and as to how they are articulated. The NFQ 9 is beyond, I suppose, what that threshold would be required in order to achieve standards of proficiency. However, again, I would emphasise we have a lot of examples of professions where the minimum threshold is a level 8, but the majority of the programmes can continue to be delivered at a level 9. It's just saying that there's nothing to stop a programme at a level 8 being designed to deliver on the standards as they're articulated in the draft documents. And again, I just emphasise as well, the board really gave consideration, I suppose, about kind of equity to access to education, and certainly they were very conscious in terms of the, I suppose, the ability for people from diverse backgrounds to be able to enter into these professions. And that was one of the considerations, I suppose, or one of the values they held when they were really giving consideration to what the level would be, and very much that the level 8 was sufficient or could be sufficient in order to achieve standards.
Okay, I have another question. Will the board be accepting pre-existing accredited level 8 programs validated by UK universities delivered through an Irish education provider? That is, the UK university is the awarding body, but the course is delivered by an Irish institution.
I might take that one, Catherine, if you want.
Thank you, Margaret.
So by law, if a qualification is awarded outside the state, cannot be accredited by the state, it must be dealt with in what we call recognition. So applicants with UK qualifications awarded by UK bodies, wherever they were delivered, will be assessed through the recognition process. So they will have an additional process whereby the qualification will be assessed for alignment with the Irish standards. That's the start and end of that one, I'm afraid. I would point out though that there are processes in place that there's a pilot just coming to an end whereby qualifications that come through in very high volumes that already clearly align with the Irish standard, there's a lighter process being developed for them, and ultimately that could extend to some qualifications in these two fields. We'll have to see how that goes.
Okay, I think Hugh's just coming in on that, Margaret, and he's asking, is that a once-off then for a programme or per student?
Well, I suppose that's what it is per student by law. However, like I said, that process whereby frequently seen qualifications, as we call them, are seen in high volume, and we know that they align with the standard. Alternative pathways are being developed for them, but they are not country specific, so it's not just for the UK. It's available beyond the UK as well.
Okay, thanks, Margaret. Another question we have in here is, can you apply for both registration? So register on both professions. This person is saying they have a level 8 in counselling skills and psychotherapy.
Yeah, so again, for existing practitioners, there is a different route to apply during the grandparenting period. So what we're outlining here is about future graduates, about how programs will be designed to deliver for new entrants to the register at the point where the register opens. So again, just to say to that person, we have quite extensive FAQ, and we have a previous recording from December, which really goes into the transitional arrangements that are there for existing practitioners. But I suppose just to come back to, I suppose, the fundamental of the question there, can you apply for 2 registers? Yes, if you meet the requirements to register as both a counsellor or a psychotherapist, you could apply to both registers.
Okay, there's 2 questions here, and they relate to, I suppose, those who are working in the profession. What would be the process for individuals who are practicing already to get grandparented? That's the transition period before the title becomes protected. And can you say a little bit about post-registration supervision requirements?
Okay, I can speak to the supervision requirements, certainly. So again, as I've said, we're a qualifications-based register. The board do not have statutory powers to set conditions for practice once someone is on the register. So they can't say you have to engage with a certain number of supervision hours or a ratio of supervision hours. Through their Code of Professional Conduct and Ethics, the board can certainly identify the responsibility of the registrants to engage in supervision, but it will be outside the remit of the board to prescribe the ratio of supervisory hours that would be required post-registration. In terms of the grandparenting routes, again, we have quite extensive information and a video recording available on the website. I mean, it's essentially the same for all professions. When a statutory register is established, the person must be able to demonstrate they're engaged in the practice of the profession for 2 years out of the previous 5. They should have a qualification prescribed by regulation by the minister, or a qualification that is deemed sufficiently relevant, or they may be directed to undertake an assessment of professional competence, and they need to meet fit and proper requirements. But again, there's extensive information available on all of that on the website for people to review.
Great. Catherine, we have another question. If you're initially on the counsellor register, but if one does extra training post-training, can one then apply for the psychotherapy register?
So just to explain the process, so once the board has set its criteria and standards, there'll be a period of time for education providers to align to those requirements. The board then commences an approval process of the education and training programmes. If those programmes, as said, and it's up to the education provider to apply to the board, if those programmes are approved by the board for entry to the counsellors register or for entry to the psychotherapist register, they will issue what's called an approved qualifications bylaw. So by undertaking an approved qualification, it provides an entry pathway to the register. So as I said, if the person was to undertake an approved qualification, for example, as a counsellor, or then to go on to undertake an approved qualification as a psychotherapist, then they will be eligible for entry to initially one, but then both registers.
Okay. Another question we have here is, if a therapist is registered on either register, do they also need to be a member of a professional association? What is then the requirement re CPD and supervision?
Do you want me to take that one, Catherine, or are you happy with
Please,
it?
Margaret. No, that's perfect, yeah.
So being registered doesn't preclude membership of a professional body at all. And indeed, professional bodies are an absolutely great parallel, not parallel, but working alongside the register in terms of providing professional development, CPD in particular. So what CORU is interested in when it comes to CPD is whether you're complying with our CPD regulations. It's up to the professional body whether they will accept that as part of their rules, or whether they'll allow you to use the same CPD. Usually you can use the same hours for both, but they are in effect different. So while it's wonderful to have people within professional bodies and being part of the development of the profession, there isn't a transfer of requirements there. They're separate. Catherine, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
No, I think that's perfect, Margaret.
Okay, there seems to be a little bit more clarity needed on training and placements. Catherine, I have another question here where it says, how does it work with placements and the training provider? Who approves the client for placement with the therapist?
Sorry, Gillian, I might get you to repeat that.
Yeah, so how does it work with placements and the training provider? Who approves the client for placement with the therapist?
Okay, so it's not the client that's approved. The education provider should have a relationship with practice placement sites that it has an ongoing and enduring relationship with, so that it can allocate a student to a practice placement site that can facilitate the student's engagement with clients or service users. As I said, within that, and what we talk about when we talk about the practice placement supervisor on site or the practice educator on site, the education provider would provide them with training around how they facilitate, support the student on the placement site, and how they assess the student's achievement of the proficiencies and the demonstrated achievement of the proficiencies while they're engaged in the placement site. So it's not that the education provider approves the client, the education provider's relationship is with the placement site.
Okay, another question I have here, how long will training providers be allowed to align to these standards?
So boards have made given various different times allowed for the education providers. As I said, the board haven't made that decision yet. Obviously, it hasn't actually set its criteria and standards. That will only be done following, I suppose, consideration of all the feedback through the consultation. So it's at that point, and with engagement with education providers, that the board will make a decision as to how long education providers might require to align to the board's requirements. And I suppose the board are very cognizant this is a significant change for the current delivery of education and training programs for counsellors and psychotherapists. But it is, I suppose, they are robust regulatory processes that are absolutely focused on protection of the public. So I suppose the board have to be cognizant of the time and being fair to education providers to make the relevant changes to their programs, but also, I suppose, been very conscious that in the absence of a register, there continues to be an ongoing risk to public protection. But we will certainly engage with education providers at the point where the board is setting its criteria and standards around those timelines, and certainly hear the views from the providers around the time that they might require as well.
Okay, we're getting a question here about the cost of registration. Has that been set?
Yeah, so the cost of registration for all registers is currently €100. That may change over time, but at present it's €100, and it's not going to change this year or next year, I imagine.
Okay, just going back on the responsibility of the educational provider. There's a question here that is stating, so is it the responsibility of the educational provider to effectively quality assure the processes of the provider? Is this correct?
Yeah. So the education provider will have responsibility for the selection of the practice placement sites that meet set requirements, the ongoing monitoring of the quality of the practice placement experience for the students, and the ongoing support to the practice placement site to facilitate them to take students through practice placement.
Okay, another question here. Can one program be evaluated against both sets of standards? And if it can demonstrate that it meets both sets, or do providers have to write separate programs for counsellors and separate program for psychotherapists? Although within that, then they're asking, can an award still be an honours or master's degree in counselling and psychotherapy if it can show it meets both sets of standards and proficiencies?
Okay, so again, that's a decision for an education provider. An education provider may select to design an education training program against the standards for counsellors and the criteria for education training programs for counsellors. They may select to design a program just for psychotherapists, or they may design a program that can demonstrate to the board that it actually achieves both standards for counsellors and the standards for psychotherapists. But again, as I said, that is a decision of the education provider in terms of how they design their education and training program.
Okay, thanks, Catherine. Next question is, what will be the position of other professions, for example, a nurse practicing psychotherapy without being registered as a psychotherapist?
Catherine, I might do that one. If you're practicing as a psychotherapist and using the title psychotherapist, you'll need to be registered as a psychotherapist, whatever else you are. Am I right there, Catherine?
Yeah, as I said, now I would just add to that obviously if you're not using the title, but you are engaging, maybe that's like for some professions, for example, social work or social care, you will be trained in counselling skills, and you may utilise that to your practice, but you're not identifying yourself as a counsellor or not identifying yourself as a psychotherapist. So I think it's just important to make that distinction as well, that scope of practice as such is not protected.
Yeah, and there is overlap between professions, and that, you know, that's an evolving situation. But if somebody's presenting as a psychotherapist and providing the service, they'll have to be registered.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, there's some questions here in relation to placement for work students. How will placement work for students who have private practice type arrangements? And also added to that, we still need to know more about what constitutes supervised service user contact. You mentioned something in preparation, time in preparation and note-taking also.
Yeah, so I'm not completely clear on the student and the private practice. I'm assuming that's a student. Is it that is, I suppose, undertaking a placement or placement hours through a private provider of counselling and psychotherapy services? If so, that person who's running the private practice would become the supervisor of the student to facilitate them to engage through their setting, contact with service users. Again, the direct observed observation of the student, there's a lot of methodologies around there around how that can be done. And certainly, I suppose, again, education providers have the skill set around identifying the most appropriate methodology to facilitate that for their education and training programme and for the students on their programme. So that might be different for different providers.
Okay, I might be able to answer this question. It's probably one of the few here. What is the website address on which the future grandparenting process is outlined? That's all available on CORU.ie, and we'll have all the information available there. As Catherine mentioned previously, we've a section on frequently asked questions that's quite good to answer whatever specific query you have. Also, if you want to follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn, we'll be regularly posting any information we have, or you can sign up to our CORU newsletter. It's a quarterly e-zine that's sent out at the end of each quarter. So for the next...
Sorry, we might take one more, Jane. I'm just conscious we've kind of hit the 11 o'clock and there are still a lot of questions. So we will take these offline and we will look at kind of developing kind of a FAQ in response to some of the queries that we haven't had time to address in the session today. And just to acknowledge, there's been great engagement, lots of really good questions, and apologies we couldn't get to them all.
So we might just wrap up there. I want to thank Catherine in particular, first off, for that just excellent description of the process that we're entering into now and how we got here. I thank Gillian and her team for managing the whole process, and of course Catherine's team who backed her up in preparing this material, the Counsellors and Psychotherapists board themselves who have brought us to this point, and everybody who's attended and engaged so effectively and so well. We've certainly learned a huge amount about what the concerns are and what we need to be communicating and looking at. So thank you all very much for your incredible engagement, and we look forward to formally getting your feedback through the consultation processes. Thank you all very much.